You know, it's a lot easier to look back and take a look at just how implausible Mr. Burke's theory is as far as what he alleges happened to Joan Webster. Certainly we know different things now, but we didn't have the knowledge at the time, and we trusted law enforcement and prosecutors who were involved in this case. Mr. Burke doesn't offer any kind of precise explanation in the early version of his explanation, just how Mr. Paradiso disposed of Joan's purse and wallet, or even later her bag. So those things were very vague. But this theory was followed for many years, and Mr. Burke gained a conviction against Mr. Paradiso in the Iannuzzi murder and continued to hound Mr. Paradiso, seeking an indictment or something to link him to Joan Webster's case. They still promoted, even after having the knowledge that this boat was not seaworthy, that that is precisely what they claim happened. They continue to promote that Mr. Paradiso took Joan's body way out to sea and dumped it overboard in the ocean. That is documented in warrants and signed by the officials who were involved in the case. The Websters themselves have boating experience. They're individuals who would know that a boat, even if it had been above the water without a rudder, would never have been able to go out in the conditions that existed that night. You know, Mr. Burke really got away with this for a very long time. He had convinced people through the media that Mr. Paradiso had taken Joan way out on his boat and dumped her overboard at sea. He'd gained a conviction and really had tarred and feathered this man, implicating him in the Joan Webster case. But then something happened on April the 18th, 1990. A vet was walking her dog in Hamilton, Massachusetts, and came across a piece of a human skull. Authorities were called in, and an extensive search took place in a very wooded and remote area where they did come across a grave, where skeleton remains were found and later ID'd through dental records as those of Joan Webster. That ID took place on May the 1st, 1990. Mr. Burke really has to backpedal from this point in order to make his story fit. He is quoted in the paper at that time as suggesting that the informant's statement didn't really mean way out into the ocean, but merely way out. It was his boys in blue, Sergeant Carmen Tamero and Trooper Andrew Palumbo, who were responsible for interviewing this informant and working with him on his statement, that also went out in front of the media and leaked this information to the press. You know, this case was sensationalized, and this is definitely, you know, what the statement came forward with. Now Mr. Burke has to come up with a new fabrication in order to try and make the pieces fit. Once Joan's remains were identified through dental records as the skeleton buried in Hamilton, Massachusetts, Mr. Burke's got to do some real backpedaling and adjusting to make his story fit. Therefore, we need to go back to the scene of the crime, as Mr. Burke alleges, which is Mr. Paradiso's boat in Pier 7. First, it's important to note that the FBI scoured that boat and ran numerous tests on it and never found any evidence, none, that ever indicated Joan Webster had been on board that boat. So again, Mr. Paradiso has been some sort of Houdini, able to eliminate any kind of physical evidence that would link him to another individual. Mr. Paradiso, if you take a look at the relationship of the boat to the barge, would have had to hoist a very bloody, badly beaten, lifeless body up onto the barge from his boat, across the ramp and the dock area to wherever his vehicle may have been parked, leaving a very bloody trail that would be easy for someone to follow. Then I think it's reasonable to presume Mr. Paradiso would have placed the body in the trunk of the vehicle, which would also be the area where her bag was located if he had been driving as a cabbie. Certainly he wouldn't want this mangled, bloody body in his back seat if he were stopped by someone or parked next to someone who could look into the vehicle. It's also important to note that there was never any evidence that the suitcase, when it was recovered, had any traces of blood. The next thing Mr. Paradiso has to do, if we're to believe Mr. Burke's story, is think quickly and have some forethought as to where he might be able to go way out to dispose of this body and have it not be discovered. Now, if we continue to try and follow along Mr. Burke's story, Mr. Paradiso is going to take about a 30-mile trip north. Mr. Burke alleges that he began by driving a cab at the airport that evening. Dispatchers, cabbies talking, authorities that were there, anyone would have known that you would not head north toward or through Lynn, Massachusetts that evening. There was an enormous fire that night, the Great Lynn Fire. It had been burning and out of control all day long. It was a fire that actually went on for about 2 weeks before it was under control. Roads were blocked. 107 was blocked, 1A was blocked, and you likely could have seen the glow from this fire from the airport itself. But Mr. Burke wants us to believe that Mr. Paradiso has headed up Route 107. And it's not until this version of the story that Mr. Burke actually gives us the timing when he suggests Mr. Paradiso dumped Joan's purse and wallet along the Lynn Marsh Road. And then saw that the roads were blocked by emergency vehicles and had to turn around and find another way to go north. He would presumably have had to have found a western route that went around and then headed back north to the Hamilton, Massachusetts area, which the area where Joan's remains were found is extremely remote, very heavily wooded area, very small roads. This is the middle of the night. Someone would have definitely had to know their way around and know where they were going in order to find this location. And yet Mr. Burke doesn't ever offer us anyone who can even remotely suggest that Mr. Paradiso had any kind of familiarity with this area at all or not. And now, according to Mr. Burke, we're supposed to completely disregard the M.O. and the image that Mr. Burke himself creates for Mr. Paradiso as someone who strangles his victims and then really discards them. Now we're supposed to believe that he's taken Joan miles north in the middle of the night to an extremely remote area and buried her remains. No, Mr. Burke, this is a complete fabrication, and this isn't something you could even reenact. There are no similarities with the known facts in Joan's case and even your fabrications that even remotely comes close to the image you try to portray for other crimes that you implicate Mr. Paradiso for. Essex County, the District Attorney's Office of Jonathan Blodgett, and a spokesperson, the ADA John Dawley, want to suggest and promote your book as the basis for re-examining cold cases. You know, from my perspective in the documents I've seen, this seems to be more of a tactic, number one, to deny access to Joan's files for an independent review to look at the misconduct of the prosecutor's office and law enforcement in obstructing the truth in Joan's case. There's nothing in Joan's case that even remotely resembles this. If you're wanting to look for similar MOs on victims, I took a look and found some in Boston that much more closely resemble how Joan was found. These are victims of organized crime. These victims were badly beaten. These victims were buried. These victims are people who encountered Whitey Bulger and other criminals that were protected by our authorities at that time. No, Mr. Burke, you need to look for similarities if you're going to find the truth in Joan's case. And I am so deeply aggrieved at, you know, what our true justice system is really like. You've left victims all over the place, and those victims will continue until the truth is really exposed. This is how Joan was found, Mr. Burke, and God willing, she didn't suffer.